We are going to talk about the history of the Cota, the history actually of the occupational therapy assistant. And what is interesting is we just finished learning all about the history of occupational therapy. So when did occupational therapists assistants come into play, and why did they come into play? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So as often it does, it began in the 40s with World War II. So prior to World War II, occupational therapy worked mostly in psychiatric institutes, which we just went over the history of OT and how it was really based in mental health. And that's where OT mainly worked. But then, due to the numbers of injured soldiers, many moved to practicing in physical dysfunction and rehabilitation settings. After 1945, OT really started having to move out of psychiatric and into the rehab settings where soldiers were rehabbing because the need was so great. So shortages in all areas called for an increased number of aides or assistants, and we basically called it occupational therapy aides because they weren't formally trained. The occupational therapists were overwrought with work. They had so many patients that they couldn't keep up with all the patients, so they needed to train these aides to carry out the treatment plan. So interestingly enough, these supportive personnel, these occupational therapy aides, they became valuable to the OTs because they were the people that actually knew the patient. They were the person that actually knew tricks of the trade. And when I say tricks of the trade, I mean because they knew their patients, they knew what motivated them, they knew what worked, they knew how to get them to complete their therapy tasks. They also knew what the equipment and supplies were. They knew what was available in the clinic, what wasn't available, because they spent all their time in the clinic and working with the patients. Whereas the OTs at this time period, they were so mobile and they had so many patients that they were just kind of, running from place to place, seeing and evaluating patients, but not spending time with the patients as were these aides. But the problem is the occupational therapists themselves, even though these aides were doing the majority of the work for them, the occupational therapists weren't really giving them credit. And the things that these assistants at this time, they did know about the patients, but they did not know about goals, interventions, or evaluations. So they didn't understand what they were doing and why we were doing it. And that is a big difference between the assistants of back in those days and you, because you will learn about interventions and goals and why you're doing the things you're doing. So there had to be an evolution from us to get to the point of where we're talking about in the 40s to the point of where you are today. So knowing why you are doing interventions is important, and that's why we're teaching you things like activity analysis, and we're gearing you up to be able to understand and think about why you're doing what you're doing. OTs felt the personnel needed a lot of supervision because they didn't know what they were doing and why they were doing it. They know what they were told to do, and they did what they were told to do. And they were actually very good at knowing the patient and establishing a rapport with the patient. But there was a lot of things that they in fact didn't know. So what happened in 1944, the military was the first one that saw what was happening with the soldiers coming back and the need for the OTs to do the rehabilitation and things like that. So they were kind of proactive in taking these aides, these occupational therapy aides, and actually starting a in-service training. And the military started a 1-month training course, and that was pretty much the first occupational therapy assistant program there was. And then Marion Crampton, who we're going to talk about in a little while, she developed a 4 to 6 week training course in Massachusetts. And then other states started developing courses as well. But remember, this was all prior to the internet, so there was a lack of communication between states. So these states were kind of developing these programs, but the sharing of the information wasn't as easily shared as it is today. So it took a little bit of time to figure out and develop these programs. So this is just a representation of how the military started the first course in 1944, and it was just a 1-month training course for occupational therapy assistants. Okay, so if you look in your book in chapter 2, you will see these 4 women, and these 4 women are the influential founders of the occupational therapy assistant programs that we now have. These women were all occupational therapists, and they did a lot of work and research into the formulation of the occupational therapy assistant program. You should be looking at your book at this time and looking under these women and seeing what that they actually accomplished. Marion Crampton, she was the member of House of Delegates. She was a delegate member of AOTA board, and she worked in mental health in Massachusetts. I just finished telling you a few slides up that she developed an OTA program in Massachusetts, and she was a member and chair on the committee of the OTAs. So what happened is she developed her program in Massachusetts for OTAs, and then she was able to take that developmentation that she made to a national level and pass that on and work on that and mold that and kind of shape it with other OTs that had similar ideas, and to come out with some national standards is the end result of all of these women's work. Colonel Ruth Robinson was the president of AOTA. She was chief of the section of the Women's Medical Corps in the Army. She developed the program and curriculum to train OTAs, and she served on the Committee for Occupational Therapy Assistants with Marion Crampton. And this committee was responsible for needs assessment. So what was the need for OTAs? the education and the program standards and new program proposals. So all these things they had to work together and kind of figure out from the very beginning, and you all are now the benefits of what they started. Okay, I'm not going to pronounce these two women's names right. So Mildred Schweissemager, maybe, she worked in tuberculosis hospitals. If you can envision or remember that back a while back when tuberculosis was very contagious, people that had tuberculosis were put in separate hospitals and kind of isolated, and they spent maybe years in those hospitals, and this is where Mildred did a lot of her work. She was recruited as the Assistant Director of Education for OTAs at the national office, and she remained there until 1974. She worked on invitational workshops, and the workshops were held to figure out this Cota and OTR relationship, supervision, how were the Cotas and the OTRs going to work together. And in a few slides, and even in your book, you're going to see that there were a lot of struggles that happened. Now, Ruth Wormer, probably pronounced that wrong, but she was a consultant for the Maryland Department of Health, and she became the AOTA president in 1964. Now, I don't think that she necessarily worked on the OTA committee as the other three did that we just talked about. However, during her presidency in the AOTA, this was a time where the OTAs started becoming recognized as occupational therapy assistants and going through the education, and the OTRs were having a tough time understanding the supervision role. They were having a rough time relinquishing the work to the Cotas, which is kind of ironic because the OTs are the ones that needed help in the beginning because they were so overwrought with work, but then when they got a uniform, educated OTA sent to them, then they didn't know exactly what it was that they were supposed to do and how they were supposed to work out. So there was a lot of turmoil during this time, and Ruth had to work through that turmoil, and she had to come to some conclusions to help harmonize the field of occupational therapy. So as I mentioned before, there was, first some kind of peace and harmony, and the OTs were happy that they were going to get relief and like that. But then again, the OTRs started fearing for their jobs, and they started kind of being afraid of the OTAs. The students, the people that wanted to become OTAs, a lot of them were aides in occupational therapy, and so now all of a sudden that they needed to become educated, just like you are getting educated, and there was very few places that they had schools for occupational therapy assistants. There's still not a lot of places that have schools, but back then we're talking very, very few schools. So these people that wanted to become occupational therapy assistants, a lot of them had to leave their families in order to go to the schools to be educated. A lot of them had been working at age, so they were a little bit older. They hadn't been in school for a while, so just like many of you, they had to go back to school after not being in school for a while. And then even before they went back to school, their education level wasn't always necessarily very high, because we're talking, back like in the 50s when, people may or may not have finished high school, and then they were able to get this job as an occupational therapy aide. And so they came from a lower education background, and then they were going to be educated like you are now. So there was a lot of struggles happening, and there was a lot of things that needed to be figured out during this time. But if you look on page 21 and kind of follow along with me, another thing that happened is in the 50s, they OTAs started being grandfathered in, which meant if you were working as an OTA prior to the induction of these schools, you were kind of grandfathered into the job as an occupational therapy assistant. We don't do grandfathering anymore. The only other time we did grandfathering in the field of occupational therapy is when the OTRs were a bachelor degree level, and then they went to a master's degree level. If the OTR was licensed and they had passed their tests and they were licensed to practice, then they did not have to go back and get their master's degree. So they were considered grandfathered in as well. So I already mentioned about the grandfather clause to you just prior, but and basically it was because many of the workers, many of these occupational therapy aides had many years of practice, and so they put this into effect that they could be grandfathered in as occupational therapy assistants. But they did have to go through some training process to continue on with their job. So some of the issues that this committee of the women that we just talked about had to deal with is, what is the roles of the OTAs going to be, and what are the roles of the OTRs going to be, and what is the relationship between the Cota and the OTR? What is that going to look like? And one of the big turmoils is that the OTRs really, at this time, they weren't trained to be supervisors. They were pretty much trained to work on their own and to treat patients, and they didn't have to worry about supervising people. But now all of a sudden they have these codas, and they need to figure out how to supervise efficiently. What is the teaching material going to be? What do they need to learn about? So we're going to start talking about also that there was an increase in need for practitioners in nursing homes and home health with Medicare implementation. In 1965, Medicare-Medicaid came out, and what happened with Medicare-Medicaid was, as you're learning in reimbursement, this is the type of insurance for people that are over 65. They have been working for 10 years and paying into the Social Security system, like when you work and you pay into Social Security, and or if they're not 65, they have some kind of disability that they cannot work anymore, and then they can draw their Medicare. By getting Medicare, they also eligible for medical services, and with these medical services that they were receiving became an increase for occupational therapy, because Medicare paid occupational therapists to do therapy with these kinds of patients. So, and then along at the same time came vocational rehab, other insurances. So these insurances that started kicking in during this time period also paved the way for more jobs for occupational therapy. So as I said before, there was a little bit of scandal that happened, and the scandal mainly came in the form of the OTs being very threatened by the OTAs. You know, how do I supervise the OTA without experience myself? They didn't have experience in supervision. And they were very worried that OTAs were going to take over their jobs. So are the OTAs with experience and skills going to make me look bad? They were threatened because now these people were being educated that weren't educated before, so they actually knew about interventions and goals and things like that. So some OTs were worried that they were going to question their motives and what they were doing. So everything kind of, for a little bit of time, was very unsettling. And there were some things that happened. You can read in your book, there's kind of a funny story about a little battle that went on, and where they talked about this at a national OT meeting, and the secretary that took the notes took all the notes about what they were talking about, but then did not publish the notes because she felt like it wouldn't look good for the occupational therapist, and the notes got thrown away, and then they got found, and then they got published anyways, and people got mad, and it was just a really big time of what do we do and how are we going to work all this out. So as you can see in this little demonstration, that in the 1950s there began in-service programs for OTAs, and then when Medicare and Medicaid opened up in 1965, this opened up funding, which increased the need for OTs and OTAs in nursing homes. And remember, prior to this, before the OTAs came on the scene, the OTs were mainly working with people in the mental health arena. Now we're moving, the OTs moved from mental health into the medical field, into physical dysfunction and rehabilitation. Then the OTAs came on the scene and moved into the field of nursing home settings and home health because of the funding that opened up. And then there became the Bills for Education for All Handicapped Children Act in 1975, and this opened up OTs to be able to start working in the school settings. And then the handicap amendments in 1986 gave OTs a direct role into early intervention. So as I've said before, we started in the mental health arena, and then we slowly started getting into all these arenas. But in 1965, OTAs were really prominent in the home health and the nursing home setting. And when the training came out in 1961, the training for OTAs was very area specific. Sorry about that. So you were working in a nursing home, so you got trained in that arena. But then the more OT started working on other settings, then the need for the training to become all-encompassing and not just specific to certain settings. So today, in your training that you have, you are trained in all areas of occupational therapy, and you are trained as a general practitioner. You are not trained in any specific field. Now, when you get out of school and you practice and you maybe want to get more specific, there's other, you can take classes and courses and things like that to get specific training in specific areas. But you are trained as a general practitioner. The requirements for the OTA programs somewhat vary. Like different schools they may have different classes. However, we have a organization called ACOT, and they are the Accreditation Council for Occupational Therapy Education, and they are under the umbrella of AOTA. So they are our national standards for education. And what happens is, in order for you to take the NBCOT, the National Board of Certification of Occupational Therapy, in order to take that test, you have to have gone through an accredited college for NBCOT to recognize you to take the test. And if you don't go through an accredited college, then NBCOT will not allow you to take the certification exam. So how do we get accredited? Well, interestingly enough, not this past May, but the May before, we went through accreditation. This accreditation is not OTC accreditation. OTC as a college is accredited through the college accreditation system, but the OTA program is specifically accredited through ACOT. So 2 representatives from ACOT from other states came to OTC a couple years ago, and they obviously came prior to this because we've always been accredited, but this was just the most recent accreditation we had. And they went through all the stuff we had. They looked at all of our classes. They talked to us as the instructors. They talked to the college officials here at OTC. They talked to students. They talked to former students. They talked to clinical fieldwork clinical supervisors. They talked to just all kinds of people. And what they do is then they get their findings. They sit down with us. They tell us what we could do better, what they like, what they don't like, and all those kinds of things. Then they take those findings and they send them into a board, and then they go on their way, and then the board, this is a very long process, to tell you the truth, and then the board looks through their findings with a fine-tooth comb, and they go through everything, and then they give us a rating. And then we have to wait until they come back with that rating. And there's several different ways that you could be rated. And one is that you could be disaccredited. That means that they can say, no, you don't meet the standards and you cannot function as an OTA program. They can say, you are, doing okay, but there are some areas that you really need to improve. So we want you to improve on those areas, and we're going to come back in 5 years and we're going to check to make sure you've made those improvements. Or they could say that you're doing really well. Here's a few things that we found that you kind of need to get to work on. Well, not kind of, but you need to work on. You need to get it better, and we're going to come back in 7 years and we're going to look at those things and plus re-evaluate you. Or they could say, we think that you're doing a good job, here's maybe a few issues, but they're really not issues at all, but there's just some things that you could work on, and we're gonna leave you alone and not come back and see you for 10 years. And then when we come back in 10 years, we're gonna reevaluate your program. So after all was said and done, the accreditation gave us a 10-year stay, I say, of execution, because it's a very long and hard process that you have to go through. But they found that our program was of the standard that we could have the highest level of accreditation. And that really made us feel good as instructors, and you should feel good as students as well, that you have that you're going to that kind of a program. Now we're going to kind of differentiate the acronyms we use for OTA, COTA. So which of the following is correct? You are enrolled in a Cota program, or you are enrolled in an OTA program? The correct answer is you are enrolled in a OTA program. This is a occupational therapy assistant program. The letter C means that you are certified occupational therapy assistant. When you graduate from OTC, you will not have your C. You will be a occupational therapy assistant when you graduate. In order to get your C on the front of your name, on your front of your title, you have to take the NBC OT boards. After you pass those boards, then you become certified and have the C. You can't take those boards unless you go to an accredited occupational therapy assistant program. So I hope you get that straight. And now I'm going to throw another little wrench in there. There's also COTA/L. In order to work, you have to be COTA/L, which means the C is that you got your certification through NBCOT, and the /L means that you got your license in the state that you choose to work in. So first you get your OTA, then you apply for your national boards, and when you pass them, you get your C. And then after you get your C and you've passed your national boards, you then can apply to any state that you wish to be licensed. Each state has a different set of practice acts that you must follow. And in order to get licensed, you usually have to take like an online test of what their practice acts is. We're going to go through practice acts later on in our ethics. Practice acts are just what the practice requirements are in the states, because states are different. You can have licenses in multiple states if you want it. So if you want to have a license in Missouri and have a license in Arkansas because you're going to work in both states, you can do that as long as you fill all the requirements. You can maintain as many licenses in states as you want to, but you do have to pay to get your licenses every couple years, and you do have to maintain your standard of practice in the states that you choose to get your license. But this is an OTA program. You will be an OTA when you leave this program, and you take your national boards on your own after you leave this program, and that's when you get your C. In 1964, Ruth said this quote, "Able seamen far outnumber captains and commanders, yet ships do not sink, and new ships form. From sail to nuclear power evolve to meet man's needs. so to this varied levels of our profession can be coordinated to achieve efficiency and growth. So what does that mean to you? That is something that I want you to think about and try to figure out where OTAs fit in to the profession of occupational therapy. So of course, since the 50s and 60s, we have definitely evolved and we have definitely come into our place as occupational therapy assistants. OTRs and Cotas have learned to work in harmony together from the beginnings of time when there was discourse. But where do things stand today? And this is something that we're going to explore. You're going to explore in the rest of this PowerPoint, and you're going to also explore this on your own. This is something that you need to understand and think about is where is your place in occupational therapy as an assistant. Okay, so these are some statistics. The next few slides are statistics. Unfortunately, they are from a workforce study that was done in 2010, and I looked it up, and they're doing another workforce study now, and it won't be out till later on this year, but it will be out in 2015, but we don't have it yet. So unfortunately, I feel like they probably only do this study every 5 years because it is a pretty in-depth study. So it's important for you to look at these numbers, but take it with a grain of salt, because realize that, you know, in the few years since the study was done, these numbers have changed. But it kind of gives you an idea overall. So if you look at this first slide here, it's employment settings. So you can see that the long-term care facilities or skilled nursing facilities employ way more OTAs than OTRs. The numbers there are definitely prevalent as to the breakdown. In the school settings, it's very, very close. There's just a few more OTAs than OTRs. Now in the hospital setting, now we're going the opposite way, and there's more OTRs than there are OTAs. Outpatient setting, there are more OTRs than there are Cotas. You can see that. Community settings, which surprised me, you can see a few more OTAs than OTRs. And in mental health, there are more OTRs than OTAs. And that just kind of gives you an idea. And you need to look at these settings, and as you go through school and start learning more things, try to figure out what setting is the right setting for you. And I just also want to caution you that in each of these settings, there is a differentiation between pay scales in Cotas. So Cotas that work in a long-term care setting may make a lot more money than Cotas that work in a hospital setting. But you have to also understand, why is that so? Why are you getting paid more in one setting than another setting? Well, the differences are amazing. Most often, the reason why you get a higher pay scale is because your productivity is higher. That means your standards and the amount of patients that you have to treat in a time period are higher than another type setting. So a lot of times people that are going to school and in your situations, they start looking, oh, they make a lot of money over here, but they don't make so much money over there. Well, I'm going to go over there where they make money. Well, I just caution you to look into the job as a whole and understand what they're doing and why they're making that much money, because, you know, they're not just getting that money because they have nice employers. They're getting that money because they may have a higher level of productivity and other things that happen with the job. So just kind of a word of warning. I got a little ahead of myself in that last slide, and this slide is talking about the disparity in money for OTAs and OTRs. First of all, the first figure shows that 86% of those employed are employed full-time, which is good because a lot of people choose to work part-time, but you can see there are a lot of full-time jobs out there. A lot of people also choose to work PRN, which means as needed. So I work PRN for Aegis, which means that if they need me, they will call me up and ask me to work at this facility or that facility, and usually I just work in the summer when I'm not teaching school. But a lot of people like the PRN and all those types of things, work settings we're going to get to further on in your career in class. You can also see that there's a big disparity of pay. As an OTA, it says $27,000 to $63,000. Well, I also caution you not only that there's this disparity between settings, there's also disparities between states. I came from the state of New York, and believe it or not, my pay just about doubled in the state of Missouri. So when you're moving to another state, you need to look at what their pay scale is, and you can look at things like that through AOTA, because different states, have different standards, and they have different needs. And unfortunately, pay goes with the need. So it just depends not only on in what area of practice you work, but it also depends on what state that you work in. And then you can see for OTRs, it's 45,000 to 90,000. And again, this is, really varies, and it's really, really hard to say because of, one, this was done in 2010, and two, it varies on different states and not just settings. So as OTAs started becoming more prevalent in the field of occupational therapy, things started having to open up for OTAs, and one of those was the Eleanor Clark Slagle, the mother of OT, has a prestigious award named after her. And this is like one of the highest honors that you can get in OT. And at one time it was only for OTRs, but now OTAs can and are eligible for this award. There has not been an OTA yet that has gotten this award, but that doesn't mean that you or someone in your class may one day aspire to this. There are other national awards that OTAs can get, and this is on the AOTA website. It's also in your book. There's the Roster of Honor Award, and of course this is given to OTAs that have made a significant contribution in the field of occupational therapy. Another national award is the Award of Excellence, and this is in the advancement of occupational therapy. You have a timeline in your book that I want you to look at. There's a lot of interesting facts. You are also going to be doing a timeline as your assignment, but when you do your assignment, you can look at that timeline and you can get ideas, but I do not want you to copy verbatim what that timeline is in your book. Some interesting timeline facts that I picked out to emphasize is that the first national certification exam for OTAs happened in 1977. So even though we established that OTA started in the 60s with formal education, it was not until 1977 that the first national certification exam became available to Cota. So that wasn't really too long ago. For some of you, you can't even imagine what 1977 was like, but it wasn't very long ago. So before this, there was not COTAs, there was only occupational therapy assistants, because remember, you can't be a COTA until you take that certification exam. And then in 78 was the Roster of Honor Award established that I just talked about. And in 1985, the first occupational therapy assistant became a representative elected to the Representative Assembly. We're going to talk about this in a couple more lessons, but the Representative Assembly is a person that is representing a state. So like in Missouri, we have a representative who represents Missouri Occupational Therapy to the American Occupational Therapy Association. So they are a liaison between the national office and our state office. And in 1987, AOTA said that OTRs or OTAs can be elected president of AOTA. We have not had a OTA president yet, but again, that is your future. I stuck this name in. This is a real person, and she is on the board of directors of AOTA. And as you can see, she's a COTA, just informing you that COTAs, can be just as powerful and in powerful positions in the profession of occupational therapy, and she is on the board of director of AOTA. So in your homework that you will be doing this week, you will be exploring what's new for OTAs in 2015. Now obviously I know some things that are happening and that are being discussed within the Organization of American Occupational Therapy Association that will affect you directly, because you will be graduating, in a couple years, and so these decisions that are being looked at and being made now will directly affect you. So this is one of the things that I'm going to ask you to research and figure out. We have a occupational therapy assistant representative to the Missouri Occupational Therapy Association, and her name is Cindy Kempf. And as the semester goes and we learn about professional organizations, this will mean a little bit more to you. But just so you know that we always have representation as occupational therapy assistants. And you will figure out also as the semester goes on that occupational therapy assistants and occupational therapists, they have different concerns and different needs. So it's important that we have a person that represents our profession. Things that you're going to be learning in school, and I know that, some of the things that we're doing in foundation is not as exciting or as concrete as neuro or dynamics, because those are specific and you can see, specific details that you're doing in dynamics. But in foundation, you're learning the foundation of occupational therapy because it will affect you. It will affect you as a practitioner, and you have got to understand challenges that you're going to face as an assistant in today's healthcare atmosphere, because healthcare is changing, and it's good that you're going to be able to be a good practitioner and to know your skills, your practicing skills, but you also have to know, you have to know about reimbursement, and you have to know about leadership and supervision, and you have to understand other things as well so you can work with other people. And having a good OTR Cota relationship is one of those important things that you need to learn how to be able to show that you are competent to the OTR that you're working with, and to have a relationship that inspires you to grow and to do more. And these are some of the skills that you'll be learning in this foundation class and some other classes as you go through your um, semester. So even though it's different, this class is different than some of your other classes, it is justly as important. Okay, so now we have just gone through the history of the occupational therapy assistant. You know where you came from. You know the struggles that were in the past, and now you're going to look at what your future is like and what struggles that you are going to have as an assistant. So I want you to continue on with the lesson and the things that are set up in your lesson, and if you have any questions, let me know.